Everyone experiences wounds that bleed invisibly inside, leaving no visible scars on the body but deeply rooted in the soul. Among these unseen traumas, the wound inflicted by a father holds a special place, a profound and often suppressed trauma that can impact one's entire life. A person who in childhood experienced absence, detachment, or criticism from their father carries this burden, usually unconsciously. This wound manifests as hidden fears, insecurity about one's own worth, and relationships marked by longing or dependence. The tragedy lies in the fact that many people are unaware of having this wound. They tend to consider their behavioral traits as normal, an integral part of their personality. An insatiable need for recognition or a fear of being rejected is perceived as a character trait, when in reality it is merely an echo from childhood that continues to resonate in adulthood. The renowned psychologist Jung asserted that the unconscious never forgets. Everything that has not been consciously processed remains a hidden dynamic, actively influencing a person's inner world. The invisible threads of the paternal figure, how the past shapes the present. A psychological trauma inflicted by a father is like a ghostly shadow, subtly directing a person's actions until they become aware of its existence and bring it into the light of consciousness. A common mistake is underestimating the profound impact that the relationship with a father has on the formation of personality. If maternal love is associated with safety, unconditional care, and emotional closeness, then the father, in turn, symbolizes structure, the establishment of authority, and recognition in the process of a child's psychological maturation. A child who encounters paternal neglect, harsh criticism, or rejection involuntarily forms a negative self-image. In their mind, a sense of inferiority, worthlessness, and unworthiness of love arises. These burdensome feelings, deeply rooted in the subconscious, do not disappear without a trace. On the contrary, they manifest in adulthood as subtle but powerful behavioral patterns, a striving for unattainable perfection, excessive compliance, problems in relationships with superiors, or a relentless search for confirmation of one's own significance in the external world. The tragedy lies in the fact that many people suffering from this emotional wound mistakenly believe that their pain is unique and unparalleled. However, the father wound is one of the most common forms of psychological damage. Due to its hidden nature and entrenchment in the depths of the subconscious, it often remains unrecognized and does not receive due attention. Instead of seeking true healing, individuals often seek to fill the gaping inner void through external achievements or enter into destructive relationships, not realizing that the unhealed wound continues to bleed. The so-called father wound is not just an isolated incident, but a lengthy process of personality formation, originating in repeated negative experiences of childhood, in a sense of one's own insignificance and undervaluation. A father who constantly criticizes their child creates a lasting sense of inferiority and self-doubt. A father who is absent in a child's life leaves behind a deep longing for recognition and approval. An emotionally detached father creates serious obstacles to the formation of healthy interpersonal relationships in the future. All these destructive behavioral patterns, rooted in childhood, continue to negatively influence a person's adult life, manifesting as toxic relationships or serious problems with self-esteem. Depth psychology introduces the concept of repetition compulsion, describing the unconscious tendency of people to recreate situations that awaken old traumas in the hope of resolving them. However, without realizing the root cause of their problems, an individual is doomed to repeat painful scenarios from the past over and over again. Often people choose partners who subconsciously remind them of their father, thereby perpetuating the vicious cycle. Some people, without even realizing it, relentlessly strive for achievements, driven by a deeply rooted belief that they need to earn the right to live. This obsessive need for success is often a reflection of the father wound, an invisible script that subtly governs a person's actions until they consciously decide to change its course. As Carl Jung astutely noted, as long as the unconscious remains out of sight, it continues to dictate a person's life, and they tend to call it fate. The father wound serves as a vivid illustration of this principle. Until a person acknowledges its existence, it remains a hidden force, influencing their choices and actions. This wound can manifest in various ways, idealizing people who show unkindness, staying in jobs that don't align with true inclinations, and depending on external praise due to an inner sense of worthlessness. However, there is a way out of this vicious cycle. The first step towards healing is recognizing that inner insecurity, fears, and a deep need for recognition are not personal shortcomings but echoes of an old wound. The second step is a deliberate healing. Emotional wounds is a multifaceted process that requires close attention and conscious effort. An important stage in this journey is making the decision to fill the void that arose in the relationship with the father. True healing begins with the realization that the search for what is missing should cease in the external world, turning instead to internal resources. Deep within a child's soul, a question about self-worth ripens. Am I good enough? The answer to this question is largely shaped by the father figure. A loving and attentive father instills in the child confidence in their significance, unconditionally accepting them regardless of achievements and successes. A different picture emerges when the father is emotionally distant, absent from the child's life, or overly critical. In this case, a deep doubt in one's own value arises in the child's soul. The child begins to see themselves through the father's eyes, and if these eyes reflect coldness, indifference, or condemnation, this image becomes their inner truth. A child who has not received unconditional love and acceptance grows into an adult who constantly needs to prove their worth. Success becomes a condition for maintaining self-esteem, and recognition becomes a kind of drug. However, no external achievements can fill the inner void that was formed as a result of a lack of paternal love and acceptance. Inside, a vast emptiness yawns, giving rise to anxiety and a crushing feeling of worthlessness. This deeply rooted insecurity is a sinister shadow cast by the wound inflicted by the father, an invisible force that subtly shapes self-perception and determines actions until the person realizes its destructive influence and consciously begins to question its legitimacy. For many people, an unquenchable thirst for recognition becomes the leitmotif of existence. They single-mindedly strive for career heights, naively believing that success will bring long-awaited praise from figures of authority, or desperately seek confirmation of their own significance in interpersonal relationships. However, there is a paradox here. No matter how impressive the results they achieve, no matter how sincere the love they are given, it is never enough to heal the emotional wound. The reason lies in the fact that the wound inflicted by the father leaves behind a gaping emptiness that cannot be filled by external factors. In depth psychology, this phenomenon is called introjection. A critical, emotionally detached, or simply absent father becomes an internal voice, constantly saying, "You're not good enough." And even if the conscious eye tries to ignore this obsessive voice, it continues to exert a subtle influence on every decision made. As a result, the person begins to unconsciously sabotage their own endeavors, depriving themselves of the opportunity to succeed. People who carry the burden of the father wound often find themselves drawn into destructive relationships, where they are forced to defend their importance again and again. This psychological trauma, rooted in the past, is like a sinister shadow, constantly following them, coloring every new experience. A common manifestation of this wound is relentless self-criticism. The inner world of these people turns into an arena for a merciless dialogue full of harsh assessments and devaluation of their own achievements. Even having achieved recognized success or possessing obvious talents, they are unable to feel satisfied with themselves. Constant pressure, the struggle with perfectionism, and agonizing experiences due to the slightest mistakes become their constant companions. This ruthless inner critic is often an echo of the father's voice, whether in the form of direct reproaches or through emotional detachment, which forced the child to desperately seek recognition and love. Carl Jung, an outstanding researcher of the human psyche, emphasized the exceptional importance of the paternal archetype. He noted that the weakness or negative influence of the father in real life leads to the formation of a distorted internal image of authority, structure, and self-esteem. Those who are overly harsh on themselves risk losing touch with their inner potential, while excessive gentleness can lead to a loss of access to hidden opportunities. In both instances, the emotional wound inflicted by the father continues to bleed, remaining unseen yet retaining its destructive power. Healing from this wound begins with recognizing its existence and influence. As long as this deeply ingrained pattern of behavior remains unconscious, it will relentlessly repeat, shaping life scenarios. However, once an individual realizes that their self-doubt is not a reflection of objective reality, but is rooted in painful past experiences, the process of transformation begins. This process requires considerable courage, as it involves re-evaluating established dynamics and questioning habitual behavior patterns. One must ask oneself the difficult question: who am I beyond my father's approval? Am I ready to independently define my worth without expecting external recognition that I never received? This painful yet liberating step is a prerequisite for healing the wound inflicted by the father. Dependence on external validation must be overcome. One must learn to find the source of their value within themselves rather than seeking it in the external world. Only then can one attain true freedom and independence from the past. The wound inflicted by the father does not disappear with time and maturity. It continues to unconsciously shape interpersonal relationships, influencing the choice of partners and determining life scenarios. When entering into partnerships, people often unconsciously replicate behavioral patterns ingrained in childhood, seeking to satisfy long-standing emotional needs. A common example is searching for a replacement for an absent or emotionally detached father. In such cases, individuals may be drawn to partners characterized by emotional unavailability, a tendency to maintain distance, or setting conditions for expressing love. This recurring scenario reflects the unmet need for paternal recognition, which is projected onto romantic relationships. However, attempts to compensate for the lack of love and attention from childhood in adulthood are doomed to fail. The desired love remains illusory, and the feeling of inadequacy only intensifies. Relationships turn into an endless struggle for validation, becoming a stage for reenacting an old childhood drama. Recognizing that the roots of these destructive patterns lie in the past is the first step toward breaking free from them. The psychological mechanism underlying this cycle is compulsive repetition, where people tend to reproduce unresolved conflicts from childhood in adulthood, striving for their resolution or reinterpretation. People subject to unconscious desires often enter into relationships harboring a hidden hope of healing old wounds. For example, a person who has not experienced emotional closeness with their father may involuntarily be drawn to a partner who will also keep them at a distance. Another, accustomed to earning paternal approval only through success, finds themselves in a situation where they must constantly prove their worth. This scenario is sad because it is perceived as the only possible form of love, when in reality it is merely a reflection of past trauma. True love blossoms only when this mechanism is recognized and dismantled. Only by ceasing to see the partner as a father figure can one build a relationship based on genuine connection rather than a desperate attempt to fill a gaping void. The paternal wound also breeds a fear of intimacy. Some people experience a burning need for love, but panic when someone actually gets close. They are afraid to open up emotionally because they subconsciously believe that intimacy is inextricably linked to suffering, while others fall into the trap of emotional dependence, desperately needing constant validation from their partner, as if they cannot exist without it. These two behavioral patterns, avoidance and dependence, represent two sides of the same coin. Both of these patterns stem from a deeply ingrained insecurity in one's own worth and are manifestations of old, unhealed wounds. Ultimately, they prevent the emergence of true, mature love. As long as this emotional wound inflicted by the father remains open, love cannot be free. It is bound by conditions, fears, and established behavioral patterns that originate not in the present, but in the past. The healing process begins with awareness. A person who realizes that their relationship problems are not accidental but are echoes of the past gains the opportunity to break the vicious cycle of these destructive patterns. The key is to give oneself what the father could not provide: a sense of security, recognition, and unconditional acceptance of one's own worth. It is important to stop losing oneself in relationships and instead find a solid and reliable foundation within oneself. Authentic feeling blossoms only when it ceases to be a means of healing emotional wounds. Love in its fullness manifests itself in the meeting of two self-sufficient individuals, not in the union of two tormented hearts desperately seeking in another what can only be found within oneself. A person's perception of authority is inextricably linked to their relationship with their father. In early years, the father often acts as the first representative of authority, establishing rules, providing protection, and exercising control. However, if the father figure is characterized by weakness, absence, excessive strictness, or inconsistency, it inevitably leaves a mark on a person's attitude toward authority figures. Some individuals react to this with excessive submission, subconsciously seeking a strong personality capable of guiding them, as they never learn to trust their own strength. Others, on the contrary, experience a deep aversion to any form of authority, rejecting any guidance. In every boss, in every established rule, they see a threat, as they subconsciously recognize. Childhood experiences that have left a deep mark on the soul often manifest themselves in diametrically opposed reactions: boundless obedience or relentless rebellion. These polar patterns of behavior are, in essence, two sides of the same unhealed wound. They testify that the perception of power is formed not as a result of deliberate choice, but under the influence of traumatic experiences rooted in the past. Such emotional wounds have a comprehensive impact on a person's life, penetrating professional activities, political beliefs, and attitudes toward social institutions. Someone who did not experience a healthy model of authority in early years will inevitably face difficulties in the field of management in adulthood. Some experience fear of taking responsibility, preferring to remain in a subordinate position, as they feel their own inferiority deep down. Others, on the contrary, strive to obsessively control everything around them, as the lack of control creates a feeling of helplessness in them. In both scenarios, the wound inflicted by the father figure continues to bleed, preventing the formation of a natural and independent attitude toward authority. As the eminent psychologist Carl Jung noted, the unconscious determines our destiny until we become aware of its influence. It is in this awareness that the cherished key to recovery lies. Only someone who realizes that their perception of power and authority is colored by subjective experiences from the past and is not an objective reflection of reality can begin a conscious transformation of their attitude toward them. Another cornerstone of the problem is the ability to set boundaries. People with unhealed wounds in their hearts, inflicted by their father, often experience colossal difficulties when it is necessary to fight back, object, or defend their position. They are constrained by fear of conflict, fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or not taken seriously. They tend to submit even when it goes against their own interests and beliefs. This agonizing uncertainty is nothing more than an echo of distant childhood, a painful echo of the experience when one's own opinion had no weight, and any manifestation of contradiction entailed severe punishment or ruthless rejection. But the root of the problem lies in the fact that a person who does not know how to establish their boundaries is doomed to constant violation of personal space and trampling of their rights. They are like a magnet, attracting people who are ready to unscrupulously use their weakness for their own selfish purposes, whether in the professional sphere or in personal relationships. Thus, the wound inflicted by the father turns into a vicious circle, into a ruthless funnel, drawing the victim again and again into situations that only exacerbate their feelings of helplessness and powerlessness in the face of circumstances. Recognition of one's own significance paves the way for recognition from others. However, deep inside a person may lurk a fear of realizing their own strength and potential. This is especially true for those who in childhood faced a dominant, critical, or controlling father figure. Such a person subconsciously fears repeating this pattern of behavior, fearing becoming like their father. In an effort to avoid similarity, they suppress their strength, preferring to remain in the shadows. In doing so, they give up the opportunity to unlock their potential and gain self-confidence. Genuine authority, however, has nothing to do with control or submission. It grows out of inner harmony, clarity, and faith in one's own strength. The process of healing the father wound requires a person to have the courage to face their fears, the fear of exercising power, and the fear of rebelling against it. The key to success lies in achieving balance, in being able to both accept authority and demonstrate a healthy, sovereign form of leadership. Only by overcoming these internal contradictions can a person break free from the shadow of the past and begin to live truly independently, in accordance with their own beliefs and values. In this psychological process, the figure of the inner father plays a central defining role. In the depths of self-knowledge, Carl Jung identified the paternal archetype as a cornerstone of the collective unconscious. This archetype is not merely a symbol of power and dominance, but also a bastion of protection and order. It symbolizes the ability to provide for oneself, establish boundaries, and be aware of one's essence and needs. However, for those who carry an unhealed father wound, this inner father is absent. Instead of a reliable and strengthening force, there is a void or doubt within. In the absence of a healthy paternal influence, the individual must learn to cultivate within themselves the father they so lacked. A key element of this process is the development of a healthy internal dialogue. A person who grew up with an emotionally detached or critical father often hears his harsh, demeaning voice within. This inner critic constantly harps on inadequacy, on the inability to do anything right. But healing begins when this transforming the internal dialogue is a task that requires a conscious approach. It is important to step back from habitual self-criticism and focus efforts on developing an internal voice that can inspire and support. The inner father, as a symbol of strength and confidence, is meant to become a guide, helping a person manage themselves. This path to positive change takes time and patience, but ultimately leads to the formation of a stable internal structure that provides support in times of doubt and uncertainty. A healthy inner father embodies a harmony between care and strictness. A one-sided approach, whether excessive leniency or excessive demandingness, does not allow the paternal principle to be fully realized. The protective and demanding aspects must exist in balance. Care manifests itself in the ability to love and support oneself, while strictness stimulates responsibility, goal achievement, and adherence to personal boundaries. The inner father not only promotes self-discipline, but also calls for kindness and compassion towards oneself. When harmony is achieved between self-criticism and self-denial, a person gains healthy independence, the ability to confidently manage their life, avoiding extremes. The key to healing the emotional wound inflicted by a father lies in developing a strong inner paternal figure. One who is able to be both a strict and loving parent to themselves creates a solid foundation for further development. This inner father not only protects from life's adversities, but also inspires the realization of one's potential. This approach leads to deep self-acceptance and a sense of inner strength, which allows a person to be independent of external circumstances and evaluations. As Jung asserted, true independence becomes possible only when a person finds and heals their inner father. By embodying the paternal role, the individual frees themselves from the invisible chains that hold them back due to the unresolved father wound. This wound is not just a psychological problem, it has a profound impact on a person's spiritual development, affecting many aspects of their life. People who carry an unhealed father wound often do not realize that they are drawn to spiritual pursuits. Damaged relationships with their father create a gaping void in which there is a loss of confidence and a sense of security in the world around them. This gap forces the individual to seek support in higher powers, in something that could fill the missing support that the father could not provide. However, On this path, the individual often encounters a reflection of their unresolved emotional trauma. As a result, spirituality ceases to be a path to achieving harmony and inner satisfaction, turning into another area for compensation. The person seeks healing that comes from the outside, forgetting that true recovery is only possible through awareness and filling the inner void, through working with the image of the inner father. There is a deep connection between the father wound and faith in higher powers. In many cultures and religions, the father is a symbol of the divine principle. And if the biological father was absent in a person's life or had a destructive influence on them, then many have a natural difficulty in forming trust in a higher power. The notion of God, or the universe, as something weak or insecure, may stem from a deep deficit in the feeling of safety and protection that, ideally, a loving and reliable father should have provided. In psychological science, this phenomenon is explained by the transference of childhood experiences to more abstract concepts. On the path of spiritual healing of emotional wounds inflicted by the father figure, many paths open up, but all inevitably lead to a deep immersion in personal history and painful experiences. Various techniques, such as meditative practices, prayerful appeals, and contemplation, become valuable tools for establishing contact with the innermost corners of the inner world and filling the gaping void within. However, true healing is not limited to external rituals and exercises. It grows from a sincere recognition and acceptance of those very vulnerable, wounded parts of one's own personality. The revival of faith in life and higher powers begins the moment the shadows of past grievances and disappointments dissipate. Only by healing the image of the father within oneself and realizing one's maturity, strength, and independence can one gain the ability to feel the spiritual depth and connection that one has sought for so long. From that moment on, the spiritual quest turns into a fascinating journey of self-discovery and the attainment of inner balance, going far beyond simply getting rid of the consequences of the father wound. The healing process begins not with fleeing from the past, but with a courageous look towards it. Often people tend to suppress painful memories that have left a deep mark on their childhood or youth. However, these repressed experiences continue to live in the subconscious, exerting a hidden influence on current life. The past does not let go until a person musters the courage to acknowledge its existence and accept it as part of their history. In psychological practice, when it comes to healing emotional wounds inflicted by the father, the key is to be able to face the traumatic events of the past without plunging into the abyss of past negative emotions. This requires considerable courage to meet the gaze of old pain, because only in this way can one hope for its healing. The famous psychologist Carl Jung emphasized the importance of working with the shadow side of the personality, with those repressed aspects of ourself that we carefully hide from ourselves. Integrating these parts means not only accepting one's past, but also extracting valuable lessons hidden within it. Attempts to suppress painful memories can only bring short-term relief, but in the long run, they only exacerbate the wound. The more actively a person tries to ignore their pain, the stronger it manifests itself in other areas of their life. Unconscious anger, fear, or sadness find an outlet in relationships with others and in actions, often in forms that are difficult to associate with the root cause, the father wound. The healing process involves creating a safe space where suppressed emotions can freely manifest. This can be psychotherapy, confidential conversations with loved ones, or reflective practices such as journaling or meditation. Conscious work with one's emotions opens the way to the transformation of pain. It is necessary to learn to perceive old wounds not as an integral part of one's personality, but as an incentive for personal growth and healing. This path does not promise to be easy, but it is necessary in order to break the vicious circle of repeating negative experiences and gain long-awaited emotional freedom. In the process of emotional recovery, the distinction between forgiveness and acceptance plays a key role. Often people mistakenly believe that forgiveness implies diminishing or justifying the injustice done to them. However, it is important to understand that forgiveness is not equivalent to devaluing one's own feelings and experiences. The essence of forgiveness lies in freeing oneself from the shackles of the past, not in denying it. This means being willing to face painful feelings, not allowing them to enslave oneself. Forgiveness does not imply justifying the actions of the father or the situation. It is about accepting what happened as an integral part of personal history, but not defining it entirely. Accepting pain opens the way to letting it go and freeing oneself from the burden of the past. Acceptance becomes the key to healing, allowing one to recognize the wound as part of the life path without allowing it to continue its destructive impact. Practical methods of healing from the father wound include conscious immersion in the most painful moments of life and their comprehension in a safe environment. This can be done through therapeutic sessions as well as through creative self-expression such as art or writing. One of the effective exercises is an imaginary conversation with the father figure, taking place not in reality, but in a meditative or imaginary space. The purpose of this exercise is to identify old wounds and realize what exactly was missing in the past. Another useful exercise may be keeping a diary in which all feelings and thoughts associated with the father wound are recorded. Emotional confrontation is the first step toward illuminating the unconscious and guiding it into the light of conscious engagement. This allows one to stop perceiving the past as an insurmountable obstacle and instead see it as part of the personal growth process. Only in this way can a person begin to heal themselves and transform the legacy of the father wound into a new, strengthening life experience. The father wound, like an invisible shadow, profoundly affects the formation of personality in both men and women, leaving an indelible mark on their self-perception and life path. In men, this trauma often manifests as a distorted perception of their own masculinity. The father, being the first and most important male role model, plays a key role in shaping the idea of what it means to be a man. In cases where a healthy father figure is absent, replaced by a negative image due to alienation, emotional coldness, or aggressive behavior, men often develop self-doubt. They find themselves confused, not knowing how to assert themselves in a world that offers them distorted or incomplete notions of masculinity. Some men, seeking to fill the void, fall into the trap of toxic masculinity, manifesting in rigidity, aggression, and an insatiable need for control. Others, more deeply traumatized by the absence of a father, on the contrary, experience extreme self-doubt, which paralyzes their ability to assert themselves and lead. This internal conflict between unfulfilled expectations and the reality of self-determination can lead to deep mental discord. A man deprived of paternal support and recognition often feels incompetent in taking responsibility and leadership, both in his personal life and in his professional sphere. At the same time, the absence of a positive paternal model can lead to the search for other, sometimes destructive role models, characterized by either excessive rigidity or excessive sensitivity. The path to healing begins with the realization that true masculinity lies not in external displays of power or strength, but in internal resilience and the ability to connect sincerely with oneself and others. The first step on this path is to rethink the original image of masculinity and replace it with a healthier, more balanced understanding of strength and responsibility. In women, an unhealed wound inflicted by the father is often projected onto their interactions with the opposite sex and onto the perception of their own female essence. Often, women who have experienced traumatic relationships with their father in childhood unconsciously seek in a partner traits reminiscent of their father, whether in an attempt to replace him or in the hope of receiving the paternal involvement they so lacked. Those who grew up without paternal support or faced emotional detachment often find themselves drawn into relationships where they have to play the role of a savior, or they experience a strong fear of being rejected and abandoned. They constantly feel that they are not noticed or recognized, which of course affects their self-esteem and self-perception. In the worst case, this can lead to the repetition of unhealthy relationships or to an endless search for confirmation of one's own significance, which never brings complete satisfaction. Another common problem in women who have failed to heal the wound inflicted by their father is a blurred and unhealthy perception of themselves. After all, it is the father in childhood who often becomes the first source of recognition and confirmation, especially for girls. If this source is unavailable, a deep insecurity arises in one's identity and place in this world. This insecurity pushes them to constantly seek external approval and the belief that they can prove their worth only through the attention of others, especially men. The path to healing for such women begins with awareness of these patterns and the desire to find confirmation not in the external world, but within themselves. This is a complex process of integrating one's own masculinity and femininity, healing internal wounds, and recognizing oneself as a whole and valuable person, regardless of recognition from others. Ultimately, it becomes clear that healing the father wound for both women and men has a common basis: the ability to know and accept oneself without relying on external validation. Both men and women need to heal this wound in order to come to a genuine understanding of their identity. For men, this means freeing themselves from toxic notions of masculinity, and for women, from the obsessive search for paternal approval. Only by freeing themselves from old wounds and finding their own path to self-acceptance can members of both sexes build healthy, equitable relationships and achieve true emotional freedom. For many who carry the burden of the father wound, the image of the ideal father seems like an unattainable dream. However, it is healing this wound that opens the possibility of creating a new healing image of the father, not only as an external figure but also as an internal guide. A healthy father is a concept defined not merely by physical presence, but by emotional stability, care, and wisdom. Nevertheless, for those whose fathers failed to impart these qualities, striving for such an ideal often seems an insurmountable task. Yet consciously confronting one's own father wound and incorporating healthy paternal qualities into one's life can heal this wound and shape a new, strengthening role. The first step toward becoming the father you never had is recognizing that change begins within ourselves. Becoming a healthy father to oneself means not idealizing the former image of the father or waiting for a new paternal figure to appear, but cultivating a caring, responsible, and supportive attitude toward oneself. This is an active process that requires both internal and external transformations. In his theory of individuation, Jung emphasized the need to integrate all aspects of our self, including those that were traumatized and fragmented in childhood. Forming a healthy inner father involves overcoming this fragmentation and finding a strong, caring figure within oneself that supports and guides us in all life situations. This inner figure should not be an exact copy of the biological father. Rather, it is an embodiment of care that helps us see ourselves in a healthy and balanced light. On the path to self-improvement, it is important to realize that a healthy father is not just a support and mentor, but also a source of inspiration and wisdom. Such a father motivates one to develop strengths, overcome fears, and take responsibility for one's fate. The idea of creating this inner parent requires a willingness to abandon negative stereotypes learned in childhood. By acknowledging past grievances and simultaneously developing the qualities of an ideal father, a person begins to embody care, wisdom, fortitude, and compassion in their life. It's about seeing in yourself the best version of the father needed for self-realization, perceiving it not as a loss from the past, but as an actively cultivated value in the present and future. The process of becoming a healthy father is not only a personal, but also a social transformation. Society often holds a mistaken view of masculinity and the paternal role, based on strict discipline, suppression of emotions, and domination. However, a healthy father is not only someone who provides security and takes responsibility, but also someone who shows empathy, allows vulnerability, and promotes internal dialogue. To form a new generation of fathers who embody these values, society needs to develop new integrative views of fatherhood. This new model will help heal the wounds of the past and create a more stable, just, and humane world. The path to healing the father wound is not only a personal, but also a social transformation, allowing one to see oneself and one's relationships in a completely new light. By recognizing the healthy father within oneself, a person takes responsibility for their own well-being without relying on an idealized external image. This means that in adulthood, it becomes possible to heal childhood traumas and create a strengthening, self-defining role that promotes prosperity in all areas of life. The search for a healthy father is not a pursuit of a perfect, omnipotent ideal, but a search for a genuine and caring model of self-responsibility that can be integrated into one's personality. This step toward genuine self-determination frees one from the shackles of the past and opens the way to a new, better future. Overcoming the consequences of the father wound represents a profound process of transformation, affecting not only the perception of past years, but also radically changing the perspective on the future. Once painful memories are recognized and integrated into life experience, a new stage begins, characterized by a sense of freedom, self-confidence, and inner stability. This transition from darkness to light requires courage and a sincere desire to abandon established ideas that bind a person to the past. The moment comes when the individual realizes that they no longer intend to be a hostage of childhood traumas, but are ready to take responsibility for creating their own destiny. The shadow of the father wound often manifests itself in the form of invisible limitations that hinder the rescue potential of the individual. It influences self-perception and interaction with the outside world, interpersonal relationships, professional activity, self-confidence. All these aspects of life are shaped by the traumatic image of the father. However, through targeted work to heal the father wound, a person begins to break free from these shackles. The realization dawns that past pain should no longer dictate the present. In this moment of epiphany, life begins to change. One leaves behind outdated patterns of behavior and embraces the future with an open heart. The transformations resulting from healing the father wound are profound and all-encompassing. It's not just about shedding personal fears and doubts, but also about developing the ability to build interpersonal relationships on a fundamentally different level. This newfound emotional independence opens doors to establishing more sincere and deeper connections with those around you. An individual who has overcome the effects of the father wound is capable of taking responsibility for their destiny and building relationships based on equality. These changes are not only personal, but also impact the social environment. When people begin to break free from the shackles of the past, they create a favorable environment for healing others. Thus, healing the father wound can become a catalyst for collective liberation, where outdated and destructive patterns of behavior give way to new, healthy examples. The path to freedom is inextricably linked to accepting responsibility. One who is freed from the father wound takes on the role of creator of their life, not seeking excuses in the past. This means complete control over one's decisions, rejecting the position of victim of childhood traumas. This step toward self-responsibility is an act of self-empowerment, a moment of realization that one is not just a product of the past, but also an architect of their future. Deciding to start a new chapter means leaving the past behind and opening oneself to the possibility of continuous self-improvement. In this new chapter lies the freedom to look at the world from a different angle. A person healing the father wound embarks on a path of individuation, which Carl Jung defined as the process of revealing the true self. It is a moment of transition from childhood behavioral patterns to full responsibility for one's life. The shadow that held one captive turns into light, and one begins to interact with the world with a new understanding and openness. The relationships they build become more sincere and trusting as they have learned to trust themselves. This is a step towards a life filled with inner freedom and strength. It is important to understand that healing the father wound is not a one-time event. This stage is not just a separate occurrence, but rather a long period of transformation. Nevertheless, the act of freeing oneself from dark memories and emerging into the light of awareness becomes a turning point, opening up new horizons. In this fresh chapter of life, one has the opportunity to take full responsibility for their destiny and live it with maximum awareness and depth. This is an existence that is no longer bound by past grievances and traumas, but is filled with energy and opportunities available in the present moment. Consequently, the process of healing from the so-called father wound transforms into a fascinating journey of self-discovery towards independently defining one's life, marked by a sense of freedom, sincere joy, and a deep, authentic connection with the world